Well, good morning. Today, the Minister for Climate Change and Energy and I have written to the Executive Secretary of the United Frameworks Convention on Climate Change, Ms Patricia Espinosa, to convey Australia's enhanced 2030 nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement. This is done. We announced last December what our policy framework would be. At that time, we released the most comprehensive modelling of any policy by any opposition since Federation. What we didn't do was set a target and then work out how to get there. What we did was work out what good policy looked like, and it happened to come out with a 43% target by 2030. What business has been crying out for is investment certainty, the certainty that they need to invest over a longer time frame than the political cycle of 3 years, let alone the cycle that dominated the former government's thinking, the 24-hour media cycle. When we met with Rio Tinto yesterday, including the CEO, Kelly Parker, she was talking about a 20-year investment cycle for Rio there in Gladstone. We went to the alumina refinery. It's looking at being powered by renewables with some backup, but powered by renewables, and then looking at green hydrogen and what it can do to lower their emissions right down, but also to lower their costs. The thing with climate action is that it's all about the short-term capital investment that's required, but then you get the long-term benefit because the cheaper, cleaner energy flows well into the future. And that's what sets Australia up for a prosperous future. A future powered by cleaner, cheaper energy. A future in which we make more things here. A future in which we participate in the global effort to deal with the challenge of climate change, but also seize the opportunity that is there from acting on climate change. When I've spoken with international leaders in the last few weeks, they have all welcomed Australia's change position. Our change position of 43 up by 17 to 15 from the 26 to 28% target that has remained there since Tony Abbott determined it in 2015. Scott Morrison went to the Glasgow conference last year and gave an empty speech to an empty room with no change position. We saw a pamphlet released by the former government rather than a policy framework. And we continued to see arguments even during the election campaign about the science of climate change, let alone the need to act. What today demonstrated with the presence of the Australian Industry Group, the Business Council of Australia, the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the Clean Energy Council, the Australian Conservation Foundation, the Australian Council of Trade Unions, and others who couldn't make it because the chair and heads of the NFF are overseas, but they support the policy as well, is an opportunity that Australia has to end the climate wars, an opportunity to reach for solutions, not arguments, an opportunity to provide the certainty going forward so that we get that investment. We get the 604,000 new jobs created, 5 out of every 6 in regional Australia. We get the $52 billion of private sector investment. We get the energy market transformed, which we can see the result at the moment of the delay and the inaction of the former government over almost a decade. We have that opportunity to move forward. We will introduce legislation when the Parliament sits in July. We don't need the legislation to be clear. So it'll be up to the Parliament, but I hope that what happens is that people from across the spectrum have a look at not just the government's position that we have a clear mandate for, but have a look as well at the backing that is there for our position and seize this opportunity to head Australia in the right direction. This is economic reform, it's substantial, but it will also have an environmental benefit. I'll ask Chris and Jenny to make some comments and then we'll take questions.
Thanks, Prime Minister. Well, today Australia turns the climate corner. For years, the Australian government told the world that it was all too hard, told Australians that it was too hard, told the world that Australia wasn't up to it and wasn't up for it. Well, the Albanese government today sends a very different message. We send a message to the workers in traditional industries, in traditional energy, that we will provide the framework for the jobs of the future, as we did yesterday in Gladstone. We'll provide the policy for manufacturing jobs powered by clean, renewable energy. We'll provide the framework for renewable energy, for storage and transmission, creating hundreds of thousands of jobs across the country and particularly in Australia's regions. We send a message to the rest of the world, to our friends and allies, that we are partners in tackling the climate emergency. We send the message to Australians that we seek to end the climate wars, as the Prime Minister said. Representatives of business and the unions, representatives of energy users and energy providers, representatives of climate groups, representatives of groups who spend their time thinking about the economic future of Australia, bringing those groups and bringing all Australians together. At the moment, we are facing, as you know, a very serious and challenging situation in the energy market, what some would describe, I think accurately, as a crisis setting. That makes this work more important, not less. Setting the framework for the future, getting the investment going that has been so lacking, getting the policy framework, working together with the states and territories to get the job done. A decade of denial and delay is a decade too long. We've drawn a line under it, we're getting on with it. That's what we were asked to do by the Australian people. That's what the Albanese government is doing every single day.
Well, as the Prime Minister has said, this is an important economic reform. And it is also an important strategic reform. It matters a lot to our region. But for me, it is also a democratic reform. When I speak to young people in recent years, it has broken my heart to hear that they believe that the Australian government has failed them. That the Morrison government's failure to make any progress on ending the climate wars has imperilled their future. It is hard to think of an issue that matters more for the young people of Australia. And the announcements today by my friend, the Prime Minister, by Minister Bowen, will mean so much. Because young people need to know that democracy will work for them. They need to know that our system will deliver for them. They need to know that we will be a government who has their back. And today we lay down that marker. An Albanese government will take climate change seriously. Under Prime Minister Albanese, we will work hand in hand with any other actor in this building, any other actor in civil society who wants to make a difference. And I couldn't be prouder to be here today with both of my colleagues and being part of this immensely significant announcement.
Thank you. Just here.
Can I ask one on National Cabinet and then one to the Energy Minister? So just on National Cabinet, we heard this morning...
Cheeky going for two up front.
One each. Anastasia Palaszczuk's called for a 50-50 split in health funding. Is this something you're going to consider and discuss? And just to Mr Bowen, can you just explain simply to the average Australian what this market intervention will mean for their gas bills?
Yeah. On the first question, there's nothing new in Anastasia Palaszczuk's call for that, and there's nothing new in my response. We're meeting this evening. I look forward to working constructively with state premiers and chief ministers. We do inherit not just a decade of denial and delay when it comes to climate change. We inherit $1 trillion of debt with not much to show from it from the former government. So that's the context in which we'll consider discussions going forward. We're not in a position to do everything we would like to do immediately. What we are in a position to do as our government is to do what we said we would do. We said we would do this, we are doing this. We had a number of health reforms, including urgent care clinics, including more support for primary health care, including specific commitments that we've made, including a $750 million commitment over 3 years working with the AMA and others about primary health care and about delivery of those services. I look forward to constructive discussions with the premiers and chief ministers tonight and then tomorrow.
What yesterday's announcement, what yesterday's intervention means is that it is the best chance of getting a properly functioning energy system for Australia's consumers. The Australian energy market operator yesterday did take a big step. When the Chief Executive said to me yesterday that he felt this step was necessary, I told him the Albanese government would support him 100%. I asked him to inform the state and territory ministers impacted by the national energy market and to proceed at every haste he chose to proceed at. What it means is that the national energy market wasn't working as it was intended. It was necessary to step in. The government, through the AEMO, in an independent action, did step in. It will continue for not a day more than is necessary and not a day less. And it means that the operator is effectively determining the best way for Australia's energy to be generated and paid for and provided to consumers while the market simply wasn't functioning.
Then Josh, then Claire.
I'll preface my question by saying limiting it to one may be challenging because it's about the immediate power challenges. As opposition leader going into the election, you said you wanted to lead a country that made things. At the moment, we have challenges for our manufacturers because they can't get the electricity that they need in order to make things, aluminium being one example. Does that concern you about the scale of the immediate power shortages? And that does lead me to sort of a question from Mr. Bowen, which is, what are the immediate solutions here? Is demand management really the only solution? Some people have said to me in industry that, you know, fixing those coal-fired power generators is an option. Is that really a near-term option, or are we only looking at demand management as the immediate solution?
We don't want to create a precedent, but we'll do the double barrel last one. So I'll answer the first part of the question. Look, during the election campaign, I did say that I want Australia to be a country that makes things. I want a future made in Australia, and we have a range of policies to address that, including a Buy Australia plan. But it's quite clear to me, and it's just been reinforced by what we've seen over recent days and weeks, that the decade of denial and delay has had real consequences. And what I think is really tragic is that our plan, including the Powering Australia plan, wasn't the first part of the policy that we announced. I announced our Rewiring the Nation plan to fix transmission in my first budget reply. It wasn't something that we worked up in my office or Mark Butler's office. It was something that was worked up by the Australian Energy Market Operator. Their integrated systems plan outlined where the investment needed to happen. And it's on their website. It's been on their website for years. I frankly thought during my period as opposition leader that I spoke about kicking with the wind in the fourth quarter. In part, that was because I thought good ideas often get pinched. They half-pinched our childcare policy that we announced in that same speech. But I thought it was necessary in the national interest to advance good ideas regardless. And it wasn't a secret. Kerry Schott, in charge of energy security, had been advancing and talking about this for a long period of time. We consulted extensively. We announced it, a $20 billion fund. And what happened with the government? Nothing. Nothing, just crickets. Too busy Angus Taylor standing up, talking about how good he is. Too busy producing letters that didn't exist to the Sydney Lord Mayor to worry about his day job. And meanwhile, that's why we're at where we're at now. And the tragedy of this is that the solutions have been identified by the sector itself. What we're doing is listening to the experts, as we have. We announced the policy, we're putting this in place today, but you can't fix a decade of inaction in 10 days. What you can do, though, is to provide that certainty going forward whilst dealing with the immediate pressures which are there, which Chris might want to respond to.
Yeah, thanks, PM. No, David, demand management is not the only option. Indeed, it's not the best option. The best option is ensuring that energy generation occurs at the level needed, and that's what's been happening. We've been working collectively AEMO, the AER, the government, federal government, the states and territories, to avoid load shedding. So far, we have successfully avoided any blackouts and any load shedding. The New South Wales grid will be under significant pressure between 6 p.m. and 8 p.m. tonight. Everybody is working all day to try and avoid load shedding this evening. I'm very confident we can avoid blackouts. We'll be working very hard to avoid load shedding. AEMO and the New South Wales Minister, Mr Keane, have asked people, nothing essential should be turned off, nothing that's necessary for heating, but if you have a choice about when to run some certain items, don't run them at 6 to 8. That's just a small part of the equation. We have successfully avoided load shedding. As you know, this is primarily a problem driven, many factors at play. But high amongst the factors is unscheduled outages of ageing coal-fired power stations. And everybody's been working to fix that. So, yes, getting those...
Fixable in the short term.
Well, where there's repairs that are necessary, absolutely. And that's the generators are getting on with that. There's been some scheduled, which, everybody knew about and factored in, and they've been accompanied by unscheduled, and hence the pressure on the system. So, doing all the above is what is necessary.
We'll go to Claire. Well, yeah, but I'm doing gender balance at these things as well, so...
Picking up on that, this is now going to the fourth night that Australians are being told to conserve their energy. We've heard a lot about there being options on and off, or not on or off the table. Are there any further actions that you can take now that would alleviate that pressure? And even if we get through this period now with the cold snap, is there anything that can be done in the coming weeks that won't mean we're back here asking Australians not to turn on their power at night?
I guess
To the PM or...
Claire, what we'll do is keep doing what we're doing. So there have been various actions, as you know. The gas supply mechanism triggered early. State and territory ministers convened some short-term responses, some medium and longer-term responses, including giving AEMO the power to buy gas and to store gas and to release it when necessary. Medium term, not immediate, not long-term, coming months. We'll continue to do that. As I said, yesterday, a significant intervention, a quick intervention, as was necessary at the time, state and territory ministers being consulted very quickly, and AEMO acting very, very quickly as necessary. That sort of action will continue.
Josh? Thank you. I guess in the same realm as Claire's question to Mr Bowen, in the last few days you've sort of been playing, sort of whack-a-mole with a few different issues, like, these sort of cascading set of issues. I mean, you talked this morning about having a short and a medium and a long-term plan. In the short term, is your job to sort of putting out these fires as they pop up, or do you see some point in the next little while where there is some certainty when we get over that certain hill where you can give some certain... Sorry to mix a few metaphors there, but it's all right.
We're doing it all, Josh. I mean, yes, part of my job, and it is my job, is to engage with the regulators, with the Australian Energy Regulator. I was on the phone with Claire Savage, the Australian Energy Regulator, this morning, with Daniel Westerman, multiple times yesterday, with state and territory ministers as and when required. Yes, that's a key part of the job. The other part of the job is getting on with the medium-term plan, as the BCA is saying today. Navigating out of the current energy crisis and ensuring we don't find ourselves here again in a decade means we have got to shift the focus to planning a smooth transition. We're doing that at the same time because that's what we're elected to do.
We're going to Rosie, then Trudy, then Phil.
Prime Minister, National Cabinet sits tomorrow. Will you give local government a seat at the table, and how differently will it look and operate under your leadership? Will you give it a different name, for example?
We're going to have dinner tonight with the Premiers and Chief Ministers. There I'll be discussing the whole range of issues, the way that the National Cabinet operates. I obviously haven't participated in those processes up until today, and I'll work those things through cooperatively. That's one of the things that's on the agenda. And informally tonight, before we get to tomorrow's meeting, is the whole way that the process functions. I have spoken to every one of the Premiers and Chief Ministers, most of them face-to-face since the election, but I also spoke to everyone except for the Tasmanian Premier, because he's pretty new, prior to the election as well. And so I didn't start at zero at the beginning of the process. Part of that will be I want to see how we can involve local government. I'll discuss that with them tonight, as I'll discuss the way that we progress into the future. As well as that, I've expressed my concern publicly that some of the processes of the former COAG have just disappeared, right? We need to lift productivity in this country. One way that we lift productivity is through microeconomic reform. And I have foreshadowed with the premiers and chief ministers that that's something that I want to discuss as well, how we get that driving through of that reform, how we get better national consistency, how we remove some of the duplication which is there as well. All of that has just disappeared. And it's understandable while the pandemic was on that there was a concentration on that. I get that completely. But as we emerge from the pandemic, we need to look at how we grow the economy stronger. I want productivity to be front and centre of that agenda, and I'll be discussing that tonight, as well as no doubt we'll have a bit of a discussion about energy tonight as well. Trudy?
Prime Minister, we're just at the start of winter. Obviously, these issues with coal don't seem like they can be solved immediately. The rewiring of the grid is not going to happen immediately either. Are you able to provide a guarantee to Australians that this winter we're not going to see blackouts across the East Coast?
What we are doing is working with IEMO. We're working with the energy operators to make sure that we avoid that happening. That's why you saw the intervention yesterday, which is there. We understand, though, that you've got to be straight with people as well. I mean, I got asked yesterday in Queensland about the Collinsville power plant plan. You know, millions of dollars given to the proponents of a new coal-fired power station in Collinsville that everyone knows. Josh Frydenberg, as the former Treasurer, said it wasn't going to happen. No one actually thought it was going to happen. We spent millions of dollars of taxpayers' money on something that was a mirage. What we actually need to do is do stuff that's real, that has a real impact, and be honest and straight and upfront. Because what's been occurring is because the cheapest form of new energy is clean energy, that has been where investment is going. But it hasn't been feeding into the grid because the transmission system isn't a 21st century one. Meanwhile, the ageing coal-fired power stations have been more susceptible to outages and disruption because they're old. We know that that's the case. We had years of debate in the chamber over there about Liddell, where they stood up and said, oh, Liddell's going to stay open. Liddell can't stay open because of the ageing nature of that infrastructure. And people, if they asked Kerry Schott, if they asked the experts who were appointed by the government, they didn't have to ask us. If they asked themselves and their experts say that was the answer that they were given. But you had politics put ahead of and scare campaigns put ahead of good policy, and now we are having to deal with the consequences of that. Phil?
Yes, thanks, Prime Minister. One of the things, one of the problems with the electricity market at the moment is the lack of direct accountability by the operators to the people. Do you or any of you regard the privatisation of electricity assets, predominantly state Liberal governments over the last couple of decades, as a contributor to the current mess? And in that vein, is there any benefit to be gained in the current situation, any consideration given by wielding the big stick legislation, the forcible divestment, if some of these people continue to push against reliability and supply and put a profit motive first?
Well, ownership is just one factor. The problem here is, if you go back, give a very long answer, so I won't. If you go back, part of the problem was overinvestment in poles and wires, is some of the structures that were in place that didn't drive the investment to where it needed to go. So ownership is just one factor which is there, and I don't think it is can be viewed in isolation from regulation and other matters. Andrew.
Prime Minister, my question might be more directed at Chris Bowen.
Sure.
But all 27 EU countries agreed in April to ban the import of Russian coal. So the expectation that Australia and other coal-rich nations will be supplying the EU with coal. That's about 7 weeks away when it takes into place. It's August 10. What consideration or assurance have you been given about having a coal reservation policy to ensure that coal exports from Australia don't rob the domestic market of the coal that we would need?
Andrew, I've been talking, as you'd expect, to the key energy generators who own the coal-fired power stations about their coal supplies, and it's tight for a range of factors. There's been flooding in coal mines, there's been all sorts of factors going on. The sorts of policy you're talking about, of course, would have no legislative basis, no legal basis at the moment for us to contemplate. Well, we'll keep doing what we're doing. To be fair, at the moment we are dealing with pressures because of coal-fired power outages. The coal market itself has been tight, but it hasn't been caused by coal shortages.
It takes weeks to ship to Europe.
I'm going to take 3 more questions. The woman there. Yeah, sorry.
How acceptable
And then
is
Chris.
how acceptable is it that in 2022 we have the Energy Minister asking Australians to ration their power?
Well, what I understand is that we've had a decade of energy ministers, multiple, who've delayed in denial any policy change that was required. We now have an energy minister who's actually doing his job, unlike what Angus Taylor did, which was to run around and boast, come up with pamphlets rather than come up with policies, not put in place measures that had that resulted in the investment that was required in the right places. We now have an energy minister that I'm proud is a part of my government.
Prime Minister and Energy Minister, just before this press conference began, 56% of the national electricity market was being run by black and brown coal, 15% by gas. The wind on the market was less than 1/3 of installed capacity at 10%. In South Australia, 25%, where sometimes it can get up to 90%. So isn't part of the supply problem the fact that you cannot direct wind into the market? The only thing you can do is to keep the coal-fired generators going to their end of life and to fix the ones that you've got now and to include them in any capacity market. Isn't that the short-term fix?
No. I know that's been a long-held view of yours. It's not one I agree with. The problem is there hasn't been enough investment in renewable energy. The problem is there hasn't been enough... No, you've asked your question, Chris, so I'm going to answer it. There hasn't been enough investment in storage. Yes, you can say the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. Well, the rain doesn't always fall either, but we manage to store the water. We can store the renewable energy if we have the investment. And that is investment that has been lacking for the last decade. That's the problem. Now, in relation to the short term, state and territory ministers agreed with me last week that we should proceed at pace, with the capacity mechanism. I asked, on behalf of all energy ministers, the Energy Security Board to proceed with that work at speed. They are doing that. I am very confident I'll be able to get agreement of states and territory ministers for a comprehensive capacity mechanism. I'll have more to say when that work is ready.
Last one.
For Minister Bowen, just back to David's question about the immediate term and demand management. AEMO, have been sort of signalling that now that they've taken control of the market, that the volatility of having to deal with the administrative headache, I guess, of dealing with power companies withdrawing their capacity from the market. Just for Australians watching this, how, we're assuming it will get easier to manage in the very near term. Minister, how much easier do you think it will get in the next 24 to 48 hours? And is that sort of a ray of hope that you're looking for, or are we still not out of the woods yet?
You mean because of the change yesterday it'll get easier? Is that what you mean?
Because of the change and the fact that AEMO can now call in all the power that's available, they're not so worried about the economics of who's bidding and who's not?
Well, yes, it was done for the reason that it is the best way for AEMO to manage the immediate situation. It was not working. It was meant to be that the bids come in, and where the bids were insufficient, AEMO would then react. It was too reactive, and it was constantly reactive. It was the right thing to do for AEMO to step in and say, we are taking charge. As I said, I made it clear to AEMO yesterday, the Albanese government would back their decision, independent decision made by them, but we would back their decision. because it was the best way of putting consumers first, not anyone else, the needs of energy consumers first. That's AEMO's job. That's what they've done, and they'll continue to do it.
Thanks very much.
Just build batteries, Chris.